Alright, so now that I have my fuel valve rebuilt, it's time to bolt it back down to the tank. So as you can see, I've cleaned up and repainted this tank. I used the same paint from Case New Holland that I used on my rear wheels for this. Now, as for the O-ring that's going to go here, this O-ring is a -115, and I'll put the actual measurements there at the bottom of the video. Now, when I install this valve, this is the left-hand side of the tractor. So this valve is going to point towards passenger side. We'll stick that down in there. Okay, and make sure when you put that down in that the O-ring stays in the groove. Now, this is obviously a little easier if you're putting the valve up into the tank, but mine's like this at the moment. Next thing we're going to do is go ahead and put our screws in here. Let's get these good and tight. And these holes are blind. These holes are blind, so you don't need any kind of sealer on them. That's good and tight. I'm going to go ahead and put my fuel line on here, which I'm going to be 100% honest. This line is probably going to end up having to be tweaked and rebuilt, because when I made this line, it was back whenever I rebuilt the pump and still had the tractor running. I didn't realize it at the time, but this tank wasn't even bolted down. So this rear tank bracket is not in the correct relation to this line. And as you can see right now, it's kind of laid over top of where this bracket will ride. So probably going to have to tweak that. But anyway, that line will go in there, tighten down. So I'm going to leave this off for the time being. Okay, so the next piece I'm going to put in is going to be the standpipe assembly. And this is one that I had to make because the original one was broken, and you cannot buy a new one, you have to buy a used one. So I just went to my local store, I think it was Napa and Home Depot, got all these fittings and made it. And I did film this, and it'll be on a separate video. This line here is actually a brake hose. It was sold from Steiner as a gasoline line. I don't know if I would trust this for gas. I'm not even 100% sure I want to trust it with diesel. So I am going to keep my eyes on this line. I may end up having to replace it. But anyway, up here on the front of the tank is where this line's going to go. And I'm going to put some new pipe dope on here and then put it in. And if you still have the original standpipe, your fuel line fitting is going to kind of point almost straight back. Mine's going to kind of be at a little bit of an angle. And that's just to make sure that everything clears my power steering pump. So I might be wrong. I'd have to go look at the 861 because the 861 still has the original standpipe, and I think it might actually be at an angle too. But anyway, this one's going in at an angle. And as with all pipe fittings, or doped fittings anyway, clean up the excess. So the last piece I'm going to put on here before this tank's ready to go back on the tractor is going to be, well, obviously my fuel line that I just mentioned, but the exhaust heat shield. So these are just the original clips. I took them off, blasted them, plated them, and put a black chromate on them. These are not black oxide, they are literally zinc plated, so they should last way longer. They're just going to slide back on. And then we'll put the exhaust shield on here. And these are our original bolts. The only exception is a couple of my lock washers broke, so I had to put just a standard loose fitting washer on them. The originals are captive. And these just snug down. And this is a used shield. The one off the tractor was very badly trashed. This one was cracked up here. I welded it back up, smoothed it down. Just not perfect, but this tractor is going to be a work tractor. This will probably all get burned off anyway, but it does serve its purpose. Alright, so now all I have to do is get the fuel line fit properly, and this tank will be ready to go back onto the tractor. Alright, so before I put the fuel tank on here, I've got to come in here and loosen up my battery tray and put this rear tank bracket on. And this bracket will go behind the battery tray. And that's behind is in relationship to the cylinder head. Okay, and whenever you tighten this down finally, see how it rocks? You want this to be level with your front bracket, because your front bracket up here is bolted to the front of the head in 3 places and it cannot move. This one can rock back and forward. However, you want these two to be in perfect alignment. Alright, so now I'll go get the fuel tank and we'll get it put in. So on this fuel tank, when we install it, we need to put some rubber washers between the tank and the brackets. Now these are just some that I made from an old inner tube. The ones on the rear, I'll be able to reach in here under the tank and put them in. The front bolt on the tank is actually a carriage bolt, and the tank has a little notch in it that the bolt goes in. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and set my washer down and take my carriage bolt, stick it in there along with the nut and the lock washer, and just get it started. So now I'm going to lift up the tank and put the tank on. Alright, so there's the tank setting on here. So I'm going to lift it up and slide it forward over my front carriage bolt. You might be able to see it right in there, but there is a gap between the tank and the bracket. That's the little washer. So now before I tighten that down, I'm going to spin it around and get the ones on back here. back here we just have a bolt and a lock washer. We'll slide it up through the bracket and our little rubber washer and get it started into the gas tank. Fuel tank. We're dealing with diesel here, so it's technically a fuel tank, not a gas tank. But gas motor will be the same way, so. Then we'll take our second bolt, and this one's always fun. Because it's pretty much impossible to do this unless you're a miniature person with little bitty hands. And I'm not a small person by any means. And I just dropped my bolt and washer. And this is a little easier without the fuel line in the way. But it's kind of a two-pronged sword, because it's easier to install the fuel line without the fuel tank in here. But this part's harder with the line in there, so you got to kind of choose your battle there. Like I say, if you have small hands and you can get in here and work properly, this was a whole lot simpler. But it's still pretty difficult. You can also bolt the bracket to the tank, but that's kind of more of a pain in the hind end than it's worth. I mean, yeah, the bolts are easy to reach, but instead of fighting just the bracket, you're fighting the bracket and the tank. Now, there's multiple ways you can do it. You just have to figure out which one you're the most comfortable with. So I've got that rear bolt in there. I haven't really got to thread in yet, but it is there. So I just got to keep working it and get it threaded in. All right, so I finally got it tightened down. So now I got to take and hook up a return line to my injection pump and my fuel feed line, as well as the injector leak off. Alright, so this line here I'm going to have to work on. It's not wanting to thread on. And then I'll get this one tightened up. And then there's the fuel system all back together and ready to roll. Alright, so the last part I got to put into this fuel tank is going to be the sending unit. And I didn't film any of the repair of this sending unit. And that was just simply because I honestly didn't think I could rebuild it. As you can see here, there's 4 welds. And I know the welds on the back side are not that pretty, but I did weld this after I had replated it, so they're not, very pretty, but they are good penetrating, so they'll work just fine. But basically, I took and I drilled out those 4 spot welds from the back, which separated the lower half of this sending unit from the top plate where the resistor wire is for the sender. Now this sender the wires were broke near where the tank would read empty. However, this gauge will read all the way down to about 1/8 of a tank. So it's like if I'm getting that low, I need to put some diesel in here. I did remove the lever itself, which was 2 more rivets here, and I just pop riveted these 2 back on. And I cleaned up the little arm here because this arm will ground onto the case, and then this all grounds to the tank and to the tractor to complete your circuit. The float, I did replace it. The one that I had a bunch of cracks in it and a hole wore in the bottom. This float is actually a foam float with a brass top that I silver soldered to the arm. Now, the foam did separate, due to the heat, and expansion, so I just super glued it back in. And I'm pretty confident that that's not going to come loose. If it does, these floats are like $5. I can get another one and just redo it. That's kind of it on the rebuild. Like I said, I didn't film any of it because I really just didn't think I could do it. Those wires in there being broke is kind of what hindered me. I did take those wires and put some super glue on them to glue them down to their backing plate, and then I just took some Scotch-Brite and a knife and scraped and cleaned up the pile, the resistor pile, so that I got good continuity. And the gauge does sweep. I've already hooked it up to my power supply, and it'll sweep, like I say, from 1/8 of a tank all the way to full tank. So I'm happy with it. So to install this, I've got a new O-ring. It's a square cut O-ring. You read the part number right there. I'm gonna take it and just stick it in the groove here on the tank. And whenever I put this cylinder in here, I want the float towards the center of the tank. So I'm going to set it in there like that. I'm going to take my lock ring and we'll get it put in here and spun around. Then I'll come in here with a hammer and a screwdriver or a punch or whatever I can find down here in the chicken house and lock this in. And then that's installed, and then the last thing to do is going to be run the wires. Now this is the original fuel gauge that I restored. You can see a video of it. Is the fuel gauge harness. And there's not a whole lot to this harness. We got a switch 12 volt. Each one of these is going to go to our gauge. It doesn't matter where on the gauge this goes. And then this is going to go out to the sending unit. So what I'm going to do first is go ahead and just get the switch 12 volt put in. And if yours is still a 6 volt system like a gas model, this will actually wire in the same way. So go ahead and put that in there. Go ahead and get the washers back on and the nut. So like I say, up here on the gauge, it doesn't matter which one plugs in where. Our 2 studs that are insulated is where we're going to plug in our switch, or not our switch, but that's where we're going to put our wires rather. Make sure they go on there as far as you can get them. And then like I say, the last one's going to be out here to the tank. So on the tank, we have just 1 stud. This sending unit should be grounded through my tank. And I do need to get a voltmeter and just, ohm it out and make sure it is. That wire is just going to slide down on that stud. And now, one more piece. We have this clip. This clip slides on the seam of our fuel tank right there. And our wire, you lift up that center section, the wire will fit through it right there and just be held into place. So there's the fuel gauge installed.